Okay, so the collection I read was Lost in the Funhouse by John Barth. It is an autobiography told through fiction. It's very similar to Ulysses in that Barth uses multiple styles in his storytelling. Some of the stories are very realistic, like Lost in the Funhouse. Some are kind of clearly allegorical, like there's one about two brothers. And then he gets very mythological towards the end, which is also pretty allegorical. And so he experiments with different styles and different purposes. The stories aren't about one character. It doesn't follow one character all the way through. But the meta voice, which comes through pretty frequently, Barth talks a lot about writing and the craft of writing and the philosophy and the urge and the beauty of the world that leads us to write. That narrative voice that intrudes, that is pretty consistent throughout, even when the characters and the context change. I would say that John Barth's perspective on both the craft and the philosophy of writing ring very true for me. He comes to it as, this is what we do because we have to do it, and that there is a lot of loneliness and separation from the world, and that's both the cause of having something to say and the product of having something to say. And it's also a model, I'm not going as far as him, but it's a model of creating a story frame and then having episodes within it that show that each of them is an individual, but they add up cumulatively to being more than the sum of their parts. Okay, John Barth is still alive. This one was nominated for the National Book Award, Lost in the Funhouse. He writes both novels and short stories. He's known as an experimental writer, although he became more experimental over time. But I think that's just a label that was more applied to him as he was looking for ways to make form follow function. That's also a very Joycean idea, comes out of modernism. I think he actually stylistically is closer to a modernist writer than a postmodernist writer. But because of his place in time, he wrote Lost in the Funhouse in the 60s. He is generally placed with postmodernists. Okay. This is a quote from an interview that he did with the Paris Review. I was really entertained by the comments of the reporter in the Paris Review who was like, he just didn't answer all the questions, and when I sent him back a note saying he didn't answer all the questions, he's got rid of some of the answers there, and he says, don't ask me again. I kind of like that irascibility and irreverence. Okay, this quote really stood out to me in terms of just being one of those things that encourages me as a writer. I had to learn from scratch that civilization existed, that literature had been going on. That kind of innocence is the reverse of the exquisite sophistication with which a writer like Nabokov comes to the medium, knowing it already, as if he's been in on the conversation since it began. Yet the innocence that writers like myself have to overcome, if it doesn't ruin us altogether, can become a sort of strength. You're not intimidated by your distinguished predecessors, the great literary dead. And he was writing that because, like me, he came from a blue-collar background. In my life, the fact that I read makes me a freak. The fact that I write almost makes me a mythological creature. And so I definitely felt a sense of kinship with him, not only because of what's in the book, but what he says about writing the world. So in the interest of time, I'm just giving a quick just glance. I'm really only going to have the chance to talk in depth about Welcome to the Funhouse and Anonymate, although I might mention a little bit from other books because they are all interconnected. But just real quickly, Frame-Tale is a Mobius strip. And one of the thematic elements here is that somewhere in between writer and reader, there's a magic where the I that exists within a book is created. And so Barth recognizes that the reader plays an important role in creation, much like, the sperm trying to get to the egg, and when they come together, they create life. That's one of his opening metaphors in Night Sea Journey. Actually, that's the whole story of Night Sea Journey. And so that idea in a Mobius strip, right? You're on one side, and then somewhere you can't quite tell, it flips to the other side. Ambrose, his mark, we're going to talk about with Welcome to the Funhouse, because Lost in the Funhouse, the meaning of it changes if you've read Ambrose and his mark. Petition is the Siamese twin story that seems very out of context unless you know what's going on in Water Message and Lost in the Funhouse. But I'm pretty sure Petition's been anthologized all by itself. And then Life Story, Menelaid, and Anonymade. These two are both very Homeric in their subject matter, whereas Life Story is very much meta about writing. Okay, so just an overview of what I'm going to talk about when we get to the quotes from the book. The idea that a common person is a mythological figure, right? We are the heroes of our own lives. That goes back to like Joseph Campbell. That was Joyce's goal with Ulysses. And Barth does the same thing, only he's not quite sure the person exists externally. And a lot of the second half of Lost in the Funhouse is the narrative I questioning his own existence as to whether or not he exists independently of the character he has created for the world and the characters he creates on the page. I really love, he does this long meditation on how literature, which is an abstract art, manages to be successful in abstraction. At the beginning of the collection, he says it's impossible. By the end, he's proven it with his work. It reads as a very true feeling narrative that is as complex as a human being and inconsistent and utterly beautiful. So, and then again, bringing stories. So going to the quotes. Lost in the Funhouse. Okay. This is just a line from autobiography. You who listen, give me life in a manner of speaking. Play on ear in a visual text, because we hear words as sounds even when we read them on the page, because they are abstract. We've decided that these characters have meaning and the sounds have meaning. When you put them together, they have two layers of meaning, which is different from like a sculptor, as he says in one of his stories. All right, so in Lost in the Funhouse, Ambrose is 13, Magda is 14, Peter is 15. They've all grown up together. Ambrose and Peter are brothers, and Magda is currently Peter's girlfriend and also the object of Ambrose's affection. Theoretically, at least, the narrative voice that intrudes and talks about the writing process throughout the story is grown-up Ambrose looking back on his life. So here he is talking about kind of the convention of leaving blanks to create an illusion of reality. Barth talks explicitly about the illusion of reality and the fact that, and I really adore this from him, even the most realistic fiction is contrived to give the impression of realism. It is itself an illusion. Here's another one. Interestingly, as with other aspects of realism, it's an illusion that is being enhanced by purely artificial means. Okay. So here's a description of the mom. The mother sitting in the middle of the front seat like Magda in the second, only with her arms on the seat back behind the men's shoulders. And so that's the quote, and it's immediately followed in the text with this authorial intrusion, or this narrative intrusion. Description of physical appearance and mannerisms is one of several standard methods of characterization used by writers of fiction. So you're getting your writing lesson juxtaposed with the example. And yes, it's talking about the writing, but by putting it here, it's also calling attention to this detail. Mom has her arms on both of the shoulders, or on the shoulders of both men. If you've read Ambrose and his Mark, you know that Mom is a bit of a, shall we say, sensual goddess, and there's definitely a suggestion that perhaps in addition to being with her husband, she has been with one or both of his brothers. In fact, there's a couple of places here a little bit later where it seems pretty certain that the dad in the car is Ambrose's dad, but in fact Peter's dad is Uncle Carl. Okay, and so the author uses this discussion of how to write to call attention to this seemingly throwaway detail. Okay, and he goes on, keep the senses operating when a detail from one of the five senses, say visual, is crossed with a detail from another. The reader's imagination is oriented to the scene. It's compared to the way surveyors and navigators determine their positions by term or compass bearings. This is really good writing advice. Quite often when less experienced writers struggle with how to describe something, I talk about cross-wiring or triangulating with senses, and here that is explicitly explained. Okay. The brown hair on Ambrose's mother's forearms gleamed in the sunlight. He does choose in some places not to finish his metaphors or not to finish his sentences, leaving the reader to fill it in. And then she presses the dashboard cigar lighter for Uncle Carl. And then they're driving by the sea, so you get the briny spoon, which is both a callback to the night swim story. There's some sexual imagery there, and then it's also the connection to Joyce, although I'm pretty sure the snot green sea description isn't in Ulysses. I'm pretty sure it's in Portrait of the Artist as a young man. But I'd have to go back and check, but I'm pretty sure it's not green sea. Oh, maybe it's, I'm almost positive it's the end of Portrait, but it might show up. Maybe Leopold thinks the same thing in Ulysses because of the transmigration of their souls. So that's more about senses. So here's a detail about the father. Peter and Ambrose's father, while steering their black 1936 LaSalle sedan with one hand, could with the other remove the first cigarette from a pack of Lucky Strikes, and more remarkably light it with a match forefingered from its book and thumbed against the flint paper without being detached. Another example of that triangulation of sensory imagery. And here's another writing instruction. The matchbook cover merely advertised war bonds. It's particularly appropriate to the sensibility of the narrator, even hinting to the reader things of which the narrator is unaware. I think that's pretty important, as we often discover things we're unaware of in text. So I want to scroll down and get to the part. So we go through this whole Lost in the Funhouse story, which is really endearing. But ultimately, we never get out of the funhouse. There's never a moment when Ambrose leaves the funhouse. And in fact, he chooses instead to create funhouses for others, which is very much what the Lost in the Funhouse collection is. I can't believe how amazing this book is. Okay, so then just scrolling down really quick. In the Menelaid, Barth chooses to use quotations. So he adds a new set of quotations each time he goes one narrator back. So when Helen answered love, it's Menelaus telling the story that he heard from this person, from that person. So that's how many original speakers removed we are. And so that's another example of him using a form-following function. And then the final story in the collection is an Anonymade, and it's about a minstrel who's trapped on a beach and he discovers writing. He's always singing songs. He discovers writing after drinking from 9 casks of wine for the 9 muses. He drinks the wine. He kills a sheep. He writes on the vellum, and each one is a different inspiration. And he really loves writing. Oh, wow. And then he gets to the point where he doesn't love it anymore, where life is just life. And then And one of the most poignant images in the entire collection, a cask arrives on his deserted beach, and he opens it up, and he doesn't know if it's his words or someone else's, but that reinvigorates his inspiration, and he has purpose not only to live, but to write, or maybe not only to write, but to live, which I really enjoyed. And just the final line in the collection, other than the author's notes, which are entertaining. Will anyone have learnt its name? Will everyone, no matter, upon this noontime of his wasting day, between the night past and the long night to come, a noon beautiful enough to break the heart, on the lorn fair shore, a nameless minstrel wrote it. Which, it's one of those texts that becomes like a mirror. Like, I'm not nearly as experimental as him, but that's how I feel when I write and when I think about writing. Okay. So it's a model of using a frame, various episodes, and yet having a continual development in terms of character and context throughout the book, which is one of the things I'll take from it. Also his lessons and his meditations on the philosophy of writing, and the fact that he makes me think about the structure of writing in a really explicit way and in a really fun way that will make me more aware of structure as I go forward.